In the middle of the 3rd century AD, Rome still stood as the unrivaled superpower of the Mediterranean world. From the windswept highlands of Britain to the fertile floodplains of the Nile, the empire stretched over vast and varied landscapes. Its boundaries touched 3 continents, and its influence reached even further. The Roman eagle flew proudly over hundreds of cities, all tied together by the empire's intricate web of roads, aqueducts, and administrative systems. To the casual observer, Rome looked eternal, as if its strength could never be undone. Life in the capital reflected this grandeur. Rome was a city of contrasts, bursting with over 1 million inhabitants, by far the largest urban center of the ancient world. Towering marble temples glistened in the sun, honoring gods who had watched over the city for centuries. The Colosseum drew tens of thousands of spectators, eager to see gladiators fight, exotic animals displayed, and naval battles reenacted for entertainment. The great forums bustled with merchants, lawyers, and orators, while senators in white togas walked in procession to the Curia to debate matters of state. To a foreign visitor, it was easy to believe the empire was unshakable, for its monuments radiated wealth, power, and permanence. Yet for most Romans, life was less glorious and more precarious. The majority of the city's population lived not in marble villas, but in crowded, multi-storied insulae, apartment blocks prone to fire and collapse. Streets were filled with noise, stench, and disorder, beggars asking for alms, vendors shouting prices for bread and olives, donkeys carrying goods, and slaves hurrying on errands for their masters. Clean water flowed through aqueducts into fountains and public baths, but sanitation lagged behind. Sewage often ran openly through the streets. Disease was never far away, even in times of peace. Across the empire, life took many forms. In Egypt, farmers harvested grain that fed Rome's hungry population. Along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, soldiers lived in forts, keeping constant watch against Germanic raids. In North Africa, olive groves and vineyards thrived, producing exports for distant markets. In Syria, traders brought silk, glassware, and spices to bustling caravan cities. To live in the empire was to be connected to a massive machine of commerce, culture, and administration, a world where Latin and Greek served as common tongues and Roman law governed daily affairs. And yet, beneath this extraordinary order, cracks were widening. Rome was in the midst of what later historians would call the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, often killed by their own soldiers or rivals. In just a few decades, dozens of men would claim the throne. Military campaigns drained the treasury, while invasions on the frontiers exposed the empire's limits. Inflation gnawed at the value of Roman coins, making it harder for ordinary families to afford food and goods. The great empire was still formidable, but it was no longer invincible. Religion offered comfort and meaning in this uncertain age. Traditional Roman gods still had their temples and festivals, with Jupiter worshipped as the protector of the state, and Mars called upon to bless armies before battle. But new spiritual currents were spreading as well. The mystery religions of Isis, Mithras, and Cybele promised personal salvation in ways older Roman practices did not. Most notably, Christianity, though still persecuted at times, was quietly taking root in cities and towns, offering its followers not just hope in this life, but eternal life beyond death. In the face of growing instability, These new faiths gained an appeal that Rome's ancestral gods sometimes struggled to provide. To most Romans, however, the empire still felt eternal. It had endured civil wars, invasions, and famines before. Its walls still stood, its aqueducts still flowed, its armies still marched. The people of Rome went to bed each night, believing tomorrow would look much like yesterday. Yet unseen to them, a new danger was approaching, not an enemy army marching at the gates, nor a conspiracy in the Senate, but something far smaller and far deadlier. The plague of Cyprian was about to enter history. It would not announce itself with a single decisive battle, but with whispers of illness in distant provinces. It would creep silently along trade routes and city streets, moving faster than the empire could understand. It would empty houses, silence markets, and leave entire neighborhoods abandoned. It would sap the strength of Rome's armies, weaken its economy, and shake the confidence of its people. In time, it would bring emperors to their knees and leave chroniclers searching for explanations in omens, prophecies, and divine wrath. The first signs of the plague of Cyprian did not arrive with the thunder of war or the clamor of an invading army. Instead, they came quietly, almost imperceptibly, whispered along trade routes, and in the small towns and villages that dotted the vast Roman Empire. At first, these were only rumors, fleeting mentions by merchants, travelers, and provincial officials. But as the months passed, the whispers grew heavier, darker, and impossible to ignore. It began in the provinces, along the bustling trade routes of Egypt and North Africa. Caravans that once moved with steady precision began arriving late, their drivers weakened, their cargoes reduced. Sailors docking in Alexandria and Carthage told grim tales of crew members who had fallen ill mid-voyage, racked by fevers and violent vomiting. In towns along the Mediterranean coast, physicians were confounded by a sickness unlike any they had encountered, rapid, merciless, and seemingly indiscriminate. The symptoms were shocking. Contemporary accounts, most notably by Saint Cyprian, the Christian bishop of Carthage, describe victims suffering a relentless fever, intense diarrhea, and inflamed eyes. Some experienced bleeding from the mouth and ears, while others were stricken with vomiting so severe it left them weakened beyond recognition. Limbs refused to support the weight of the body, leaving men and women collapsed in their homes, helpless and alone. Even the young and otherwise healthy were not spared. Initially, many dismissed these reports. Disease was an ordinary part of life in the ancient world. Romans had long endured outbreaks of typhoid, dysentery, and influenza. Cities with their crowded insulae, open sewers, and bustling markets were fertile grounds for illness. Famines and wars had brought waves of death before, yet this new affliction was different. Unlike the seasonal fevers or epidemics confined to a particular region, this sickness moved relentlessly, carried along roads, rivers, and shipping lanes. It traveled wherever the empire's arteries of commerce and communication extended. By the late 240 SAD, the whispers had grown into murmurs that could not be ignored. In North Africa, entire villages were reportedly abandoned, fields left untended, homes shuttered as families fled or perished. In Alexandria, priests and temple attendants observed declining attendance, not due to waning faith, but because the sick and their families could not rise from their beds. Along the Danube frontier, soldiers weakened by the illness faltered in their watch, leaving border defenses vulnerable. Markets emptied as merchants feared contagion. the hum of daily life gave way to an eerie silence. The psychological impact was profound. Fear spread faster than the sickness itself. Families, once tightly knit and interdependent, began to isolate themselves. Children were kept away from neighbors. Loved ones were abandoned in streets or left behind in homes because relatives feared contracting the disease. In some towns, the sick were left to die alone. Religious observances intensified as people pleaded with their traditional gods for protection, while others increasingly turned to Christianity, seeking comfort in the promise of salvation and eternal life. Yet the city of Rome, the heart of the empire, remained largely oblivious. Senators debated policies and taxes. Gladiators fought in arenas. Merchants continued to sell their wares. The emperor and his court busied themselves with matters of politics, diplomacy, and military campaigns. To many, the reports from distant provinces seemed exaggerated, tales meant to frighten or entertain rather than reflect reality. Still, the whispers persisted, reaching the ears of officials and literate citizens alike. A mysterious, invisible enemy was on the move. As the plague spread silently through the empire, it began to reveal the fragility of Rome's human networks. Trade slowed as fear of contagion kept merchants from traveling. Soldiers fell ill in forts along the borders, leaving key defensive positions undermanned. Farmers who once supplied the city's grain markets abandoned their fields or succumbed to the illness themselves, threatening the delicate food supply chain that kept millions fed. Even religion, a cornerstone of public life, could do little to prevent the tide of death. Temples remained open, priests continued their rituals, but the sick did not seem to distinguish between the devout and the indifferent. The disease struck without mercy or favor. For years, the stories of sickness and death had seemed distant to the citizens of Rome. Tales carried by merchants, travelers, and provincial officials about villages emptied, soldiers felled, and markets abandoned. Many Romans believed the news to be exaggerated, the dramatic accounts of suffering overblown. Yet, by the early 250 SAD, whispers could no longer remain rumors. The plague of Cyprian had finally crossed the Mediterranean and struck the imperial capital itself. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as it always does with invisible enemies. A few citizens complained of fever and fatigue, claiming exhaustion from work or travel. Families dismissed these early symptoms, attributing them to poor diet, overwork, or the heat of the summer sun. But soon the cases multiplied. Skilled physicians, normally confident in diagnosing familiar ailments, found themselves helpless. Their treatments, purges, herbal remedies, and prayers to the gods offered little relief. Patients grew weaker by the hour, their bodies ravaged by diarrhea, vomiting, and relentless fever. Limbs refused to support even the smallest movement, and some began to bleed from the eyes, mouth, and ears. Death arrived within days, leaving families in shock and disbelief. Rome, a city built for spectacle and grandeur, found itself under siege from an enemy that could not be fought with swords or strategy. The streets, once crowded with merchants, children, and citizens on errands, grew quieter with each passing day. Shops shuttered as fear spread. Bakers left ovens cold, and wine merchants abandoned their barrels. Even the bustle of the forums, where orators once held court and crowds debated politics, diminished. People avoided one another, afraid that proximity meant exposure to the invisible killer. The first, truly large-scale outbreaks struck neighborhoods densely packed with insulae. In these crowded apartment blocks, Disease spread quickly from one family to another. Entire households were struck simultaneously. Families abandoned sick relatives in desperation, while others attempted to care for them with what little knowledge and remedies they had. Priests and healers became overwhelmed. Temples and shrines, usually places of solace, were flooded with people seeking divine intervention. Yet the disease seemed indifferent to devotion or sacrifice. The Roman authorities, unprepared for a disaster of this magnitude, struggled to respond. Grain shipments and food supplies were disrupted as laborers fell ill, leaving markets unable to provide for the city's growing population. Soldiers stationed within and near Rome weakened, leaving key defenses understaffed and vulnerable. The emperor and his advisors consulted physicians, religious leaders, and augurs, desperately searching for solutions. Yet the illness marched forward, regardless of their counsel. Fear and superstition intensified. Some Romans believed the plague was punishment from the gods for moral decay or failure to honor Rome's traditions. Others suspected divine wrath against Christians, whom they saw as outsiders in the empire. Christians, meanwhile, often cared for the sick and dying, providing relief and comfort where official institutions could not. These acts of compassion were noted by historians, revealing both the societal fracture and the resilience that human kindness could bring even in the darkest times. As the weeks passed, Rome's vibrant culture was replaced by quiet desperation. The amphitheaters were empty, festivals and games were postponed or canceled. Families hesitated to gather for communal meals. Funerals, once solemn and dignified, became hurried affairs as the sheer number of deaths overwhelmed traditional customs. Mass graves were dug outside the city walls to accommodate the mounting toll, and cries of grief echoed through neighborhoods as loved ones were claimed one by one. For ordinary Romans, daily life became a careful negotiation with mortality. Every interaction, every trip to the market, every visit to a neighbor became a potential encounter with death. Children were kept indoors, mothers worried over every cough, and men feared leaving home for work or military duties. Even the mighty structures of Rome, the forums, temples, and roads, offered no protection. The city's grandeur could not shield its people from the microscopic enemy moving silently among them. The first outbreak in Rome marked a turning point. The whispers that had once seemed distant became undeniable reality. The plague was no longer an abstract threat in far-off provinces. It had arrived at the empire's heart. The people of Rome, who had long believed themselves invincible, were forced to confront a new and terrifying vulnerability that no amount of wealth, power, or political influence could protect them from an invisible force that did not discriminate between rich and poor, soldier and senator, pagan or Christian. As the first cases of the plague of Cyprian gripped Rome, the disease did not remain confined to the capital. Rome's vast network of roads, ports, and trade routes, once a symbol of its strength, became the very channels by which the sickness traveled. From the city's bustling harbors, ships carrying grain, wine, and olive oil inadvertently carried the plague to distant provinces. Soldiers moving along frontier roads, merchants crisscrossing the empire, and travelers in search of safety or opportunity unwittingly became vectors, spreading the disease to places that had not yet known its horrors. In Gaul, cities along the Rhine and Loire rivers began reporting unusual illnesses. Entire households fell ill in a matter of days, and local physicians, accustomed to treating fevers, dysentery, and injuries from daily labor, were quickly overwhelmed. Villages that had once been centers of trade and agriculture emptied as families fled in desperation, leaving behind homes stocked with food that would spoil and livestock untended. The countryside, normally lively with farmers tending wheat and vineyards, grew eerily quiet. North Africa, too, felt the plague's deadly march. Port cities like Carthage, bustling with merchants from Egypt, Rome, and beyond, saw illness strike sailors and dock workers first. Markets that had once overflowed with spices, textiles, and foodstuffs were suddenly abandoned. Traders and citizens alike began to avoid public gatherings. Religious and civic leaders struggled to maintain order as fear escalated. Some sought solace in traditional pagan rituals, offering sacrifices and prayers to appease the gods, while others turned to the Christian communities that had quietly expanded across towns, offering care and comfort to the sick. The East, from Asia Minor to Syria and Egypt, was similarly affected. Caravan routes carrying goods such as silk, glassware, and spices now carried disease alongside wealth. Fortresses along strategic borders found their garrisons depleted as soldiers succumbed to illness. Cities with large populations dependent on trade and centralized administration experienced severe disruption. Farms went untended, artisans abandoned workshops, and food shortages began to ripple through regions previously considered secure. The plague spread with ruthless efficiency because it exploited what had always been Rome's greatest strength: connectivity. Roads that had allowed armies to move quickly, letters to travel efficiently, and merchants to expand commerce now became arteries for contagion. It was invisible, relentless, and indiscriminate. No province was immune, whether urban or rural, rich or poor. The disease respected no social hierarchy. Senators and slaves alike fell victim to its merciless grip. Rumors and fear often traveled faster than the disease itself. Reports from affected provinces reached distant cities, sometimes exaggerating the devastation, other times confirming it. Officials in unaffected areas struggled to respond preemptively, implementing quarantines or limiting travel where possible, but the empire's size and complexity made such measures only partially effective. Families isolated themselves as best they could, but avoidance could not stop the inevitable spread. One of the most striking features of the plague's expansion was its psychological impact. As reports arrived from neighboring provinces, citizens realized that the sickness was unstoppable and universal. Markets emptied, civic gatherings were canceled, and religious observances shifted from celebration to desperate supplication. People's trust in political authorities and traditional medicine began to erode. Leaders tried to calm the populace, yet their pronouncements often fell flat against the tangible reality of illness and death that crept closer day by day. The empire, though vast and organized, had never faced a threat so silent and pervasive. Wars could be fought, rebellions crushed, and borders defended, but the plague required no strategy, no armies, no politics. It moved according to its own invisible logic, indifferent to human plans. Provinces that had once thrived on trade and culture now saw their economies falter, their populations decline, and their social structures strained to the breaking point. By the time the plague of Cyprian had spread to the furthest corners of the empire, it had transformed the Mediterranean world into a place of anxiety and uncertainty. Rome remained the center of power, but the disease had already shown that imperial strength could not guarantee immunity. Every province, city, and village faced the same stark reality: the plague would continue its relentless march, leaving devastation and fear in its wake, reshaping the empire in ways no one could yet imagine. By the time the plague of Cyprian had firmly taken hold, the rhythms of daily life across the Roman Empire had been profoundly disrupted. Streets that once bustled with merchants, soldiers, and citizens now echoed with an eerie silence, punctuated only by the occasional hurried steps of those desperate to escape infected areas. Markets that had overflowed with fresh produce, olives, wine, and grain became ghostly, stalls abandoned, as fear gripped both sellers and buyers alike. For the average Roman citizen, the threat of infection was constant and invisible. People avoided gatherings and social rituals that had defined Roman life. Banquets, festivals, religious ceremonies were reduced or canceled entirely. Families withdrew into their homes, often isolating the sick to spare others from contagion, though many did not survive even under the most vigilant care. The wealthy could afford to retreat into secluded villas with supplies of food and water, but the poor, packed into insulae, crowded apartment buildings, were far more vulnerable. Slaves, servants, and laborers found themselves at the front lines of exposure, tending to tasks that could not be abandoned. Fear reshaped every aspect of urban life. Public baths, once centers of social and cultural interaction, were avoided. Temples saw declining attendance as citizens feared that gathering indoors increased their chances of contracting the disease. Even funerary practices were altered. Mass graves replaced individual tombs in many areas, and the pace of death often outstripped the ability of families or officials to perform traditional rites. The sight of pallbearers carrying bodies through deserted streets became a common haunting image in the minds of survivors. In rural areas, the effects were just as devastating, though quieter. Farmers abandoned fields or worked under the constant worry that any neighbor or traveler might introduce infection. Herds of livestock sometimes went unattended, and local economies faltered as trade slowed to a trickle. Villages became self-contained, insular communities struggling to survive amid dwindling manpower and growing anxiety. For the Roman military, the plague was catastrophic. Garrisons along the frontiers were depleted as soldiers fell ill or died, weakening defenses against invading tribes. Recruitment and training slowed, leaving armies less prepared to maintain Rome's borders or respond to rebellion. Military logistics, already a complex operation, became nearly impossible to sustain as supply lines were disrupted by sickness among traders, sailors, and laborers. Psychologically, the fear of infection reshaped human behavior. Suspicion of strangers intensified. Rumors spread, sometimes blaming outsiders, Christians, or bad omens for the plague. Traditional medicine and rituals were often of little help, leaving people desperate for remedies. Physicians, priests, and midwives alike faced overwhelming demand, and many succumbed themselves, further deepening the sense of despair. Families grappled with moral and practical dilemmas: how to care for the sick without endangering themselves, when to leave the ill to die in isolation, and whether to abandon homes or flee cities entirely. Yet amid the fear, human resilience endured. Communities sought to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Neighbors shared supplies cautiously. Small religious groups offered comfort and care to the afflicted, and those who survived the initial waves adapted to new routines. Daily life became a careful negotiation between survival and social cohesion, as Romans learned to navigate a world dominated by uncertainty and death. The plague revealed stark inequalities in Roman society. Wealth offered protection and relative safety, but even the richest were not immune. Poverty, overcrowding and lack of access to care turned ordinary people into the most vulnerable. Every citizen, regardless of status, came to understand the fragility of life under an invisible enemy, and the once unshakable confidence of the empire began to erode. In the end, daily life during the plague of Cyprian was a delicate balance of fear, survival, and adaptation. Romans learned to live with the constant presence of death, to modify rituals and routines, and to find ways, small though they were, to maintain social bonds. The plague did not merely kill bodies, it reshaped the very texture of daily life, leaving behind an empire haunted by memory, anxiety, and a newfound understanding of mortality. As the plague of Cyprian swept through the empire, Roman medicine and healing practices faced their greatest challenge yet. The empire, famed for its engineering, roads, and sanitation systems, was unprepared for a disease that spread invisibly and killed indiscriminately. Physicians, midwives, and religious healers, all pillars of Roman healthcare, found themselves confronting a crisis unlike any before, where conventional knowledge often failed and fear spread faster than the disease itself. Roman medicine in the 3rd century relied heavily on humoral theory, inherited from Greek traditions. Illnesses were understood as imbalances of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and treatments aimed to restore harmony through diet, purging, bleeding, and herbal remedies. Physicians would examine patients' pulses, inspect their urine, and prescribe concoctions of roots, oils, and minerals. But the plague of Cyprian defied such understanding. Symptoms: fever, diarrhea, vomiting, and skin lesions appeared suddenly, spreading rapidly from household to household, city to city. Even experienced doctors were helpless in halting the tide of death. Midwives and local healers played a crucial role, particularly in rural areas. Women trained in herbal medicine and midwifery became frontline caregivers, tending not only to childbirth, but also to the sick. They offered poultices, teas, and prayers, often working tirelessly with minimal supplies. These healers were respected for their knowledge, but even their most potent remedies could not stop the epidemic, leaving communities desperate and fearful. Religious and spiritual approaches intertwined with medicine. Romans often turned to temples, priests, and rituals for protection and cure. Offerings were made to gods such as Apollo, associated with healing, and prayers were recited for divine intervention. Some believed that sacrifices or penance could cleanse the city of disease. While these practices provided psychological comfort and a sense of control, they did little to curb the spread of the plague. In many cases, temples themselves became sites of contagion, as gatherings facilitated the transmission of illness. Physicians themselves faced moral dilemmas. Many abandoned their practices out of fear, while others continued to care for patients despite the high risk of infection. Their courage, though admirable, was often insufficient. Hospitals, few and poorly equipped, could not cope with the sheer number of cases. Urban centers with dense populations suffered the highest fatalities, overwhelming the skills of even the most experienced healers. The epidemic also exposed social inequalities in access to care. Wealthy Romans could hire private physicians, retreat to secluded villas, or import exotic remedies, whereas the poor relied on local healers or improvised treatments. The disparity meant that survival often depended as much on social status as on health or resilience. Despite the limited effectiveness of Roman medicine against the plague of Cyprian, The crisis spurred adaptations. Caregivers began practicing rudimentary forms of quarantine, isolating the sick from healthy populations when possible. Some communities experimented with sanitation measures, such as burning contaminated bedding or cleaning streets. Though these efforts were inconsistent and based on partial understanding, they represented early attempts at organized epidemic response. Bullas tisov place damies of Asians and of place su and better tove of Asians Beletu. Ultimately, the plague highlighted both the limits and the strengths of Roman medicine. Knowledge, courage, and dedication could save some lives, but the empire's most advanced medical practices could not prevent widespread suffering. The healers of Rome became symbols of human perseverance in the face of an invisible enemy, a reminder that even amid tragedy, compassion and care persisted. Ordinary Romans had to adapt quickly to a world turned upside down. Families and communities became the first line of defense, not only against the disease itself, but against the fear, isolation, and societal disruption it caused. Survival depended as much on social bonds and mutual support as on food, shelter, or medical knowledge. Roman households were typically multi-generational, combining parents, children, and sometimes extended family under one roof. This structure became both a strength and a vulnerability. Families provided care for the sick, sharing food, water, and blankets, and offering emotional support when despair threatened to overwhelm. At the same time, the close quarters accelerated the transmission of disease. Parents watched helplessly as children succumbed, and elders, often the most respected and influential members of the household, fell victim to a sickness they could neither see nor predict. Neighborhood communities, especially in Rome's crowded urban districts, faced unprecedented challenges. Residents organized rudimentary systems to support one another. Wealthier families sometimes provided grain and money to poorer neighbors, while local artisans and merchants pooled resources to maintain essential goods. Public spaces, though potentially dangerous as sites of contagion, also served as hubs for information sharing. Word spread about symptoms, survival strategies, and emerging rumors of divine punishment or foreign curses, shaping collective understanding of the plague. Religious life remained central to community resilience. Households conducted private rituals, while temples and shrines hosted prayers and offerings intended to appease the gods. Some communities organized processions and festivals to invoke protection, despite the risks of gathering. These shared spiritual practices provided comfort, reinforcing a sense of belonging and mutual support even as fear permeated every street. The social fabric of Rome was tested in other ways as well. Funerary customs, highly ritualized in Roman society, became strained. Bodies piled up faster than families could bury them, and professional undertakers were overwhelmed. In many cases, families had to improvise graves or cremate their dead in haste, mourning in private rather than in public ceremony. These adaptations reflected both the desperation and resilience of communities, determined to honor their dead despite unimaginable circumstances. Children and the elderly faced particular vulnerability. Parents and caregivers struggled to shield the young from sickness while continuing daily survival tasks such as securing food, water, and firewood. Elderly family members, often repositories of knowledge, were at high risk but also remained central in guiding households through crisis, passing down advice and coping strategies. Neighborhood solidarity also extended to shared labor. Farmers and craftsmen helped neighbors maintain essential food production, ensuring that markets continued to operate and that urban populations could access basic supplies. These networks of cooperation blurred social boundaries, at least temporarily, as survival demanded collaboration over hierarchy. At the same time, fear and scarcity sometimes bred conflict. Hoarding, theft, and disputes over scarce resources occurred, revealing the fragility of social cohesion under extreme stress. Roman authorities attempted to enforce order, but the sheer scale of the epidemic often left local communities to fend for themselves. In the end, the story of families and neighborhoods during the plague of Cyprian is one of both tragedy and resilience. While the epidemic caused profound suffering, it also demonstrated the enduring strength of human bonds. In homes, alleys, and marketplaces, Romans adapted, supported one another, and preserved a sense of continuity in the face of overwhelming loss. Their experiences reveal that even in the darkest times, family and community were the pillars that held society together. As the plague of Cyprian swept across the Roman Empire, leaving devastation in its wake, people were forced to confront not only the physical reality of sickness, but the existential questions it provoked. Life, once seemingly predictable and ordered, had become fragile and frightening. In a world where medicine was rudimentary and the causes of disease largely mysterious, Romans turned instinctively to the spiritual and the supernatural, seeking meaning and reassurance in the face of the unknown. Religion in Rome was a daily, tangible force. Families maintained household shrines dedicated to the Lares and Penates, the protective spirits of home and hearth, offering food, incense, and prayers to maintain favor and ward off disaster. Larger cities held impressive temples dedicated to major deities, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Apollo, where public rituals and sacrifices were performed. The plague, invisible yet deadly, challenged Romans' understanding of the divine. Why would the gods allow such suffering? Many concluded it was punishment for human failings, moral decay, impiety, or political corruption, and sought to atone through ritual. Superstition flourished alongside formal religion. Comets streaking across the sky, or sudden eclipses were interpreted as ominous signs. Folk remedies, charms, and amulets promised protection. People clutched herbs believed to purify the air, or hung talismans around their doors, hoping to keep death and disease at bay. In marketplaces, one could find a mix of religious devotion and practical survival, a priest offering a blessing, a herbalist selling garlic and juniper for protection, and a desperate mother wrapping a charm around her child's wrist. Christianity, though still a minority faith, offered a distinct perspective. Early Christians interpreted the plague as a test of faith or an opportunity to demonstrate moral fortitude. Accounts from church writers describe believers caring for the sick, often risking their own lives, driven by the conviction that compassion and service were central to salvation. Such actions stood in stark contrast to the fear and avoidance displayed in some pagan circles, where communities sometimes fled infected areas, abandoning the sick to quarantine themselves or survive. These acts of charity helped some Christians survive and strengthened the appeal of the faith, planting seeds for its later expansion throughout the empire. Amid fear and devotion, public rituals and spectacles increased. Processions wound through cities, accompanied by prayers and chants, as priests and citizens begged for divine mercy. Fasts were declared, temples were rededicated, and vows were made in desperate hope that the gods would intervene. Yet superstition could also manifest darkly. Scapegoating, accusations, and social tension rose as communities sought someone or something to blame. Foreigners, minority groups, or politically unpopular individuals were sometimes accused of inviting divine wrath, reflecting the human need to externalize fear during crises. Life in daily reality remained harsh. Families mourned neighbors, friends, and loved ones with little understanding of why some lived and others died. Citizens adapted routines to accommodate the invisible threat. Homes were cleaned obsessively, gatherings were limited, and people avoided crowded marketplaces. Yet for many, religious and superstitious practices provided structure and a sense of agency in an otherwise uncontrollable situation. Lighting a candle at an altar, carrying a protective charm, or participating in a public ritual gave people a tangible way to act, even when the plague rendered them helpless in most practical matters. Stories passed down from this time reveal both despair and resilience. A father might leave offerings at a shrine while caring for a sick child. A widow might pray for the soul of a deceased husband, finding solace in ceremony. A soldier might cling to a talisman while guarding a threatened frontier, torn between duty and fear. These human experiences underscore the deeply personal ways Romans sought meaning and comfort in spiritual and superstitious practices. Ultimately, the plague of Cyprian illustrated the inseparable intertwining of belief, fear, and human psychology. Religion and superstition were not merely idle practices, they were lifelines, guiding behavior, providing solace, and shaping community responses. They reveal how individuals and societies confront mortality, interpret catastrophe, and attempt to assert control over forces far beyond their understanding. In the shadow of the plague, Romans discovered that survival was as much a matter of faith and hope as it was of bread and medicine. Life in Rome demanded resilience, especially when illness struck. Medical knowledge existed, but it was fragmented, combining scholarly theory, centuries-old traditions, and folk practices that had been passed down through generations. For the average Roman, sickness was not just a physical threat, it was a social and psychological challenge. Families, neighborhoods, and even entire communities had to navigate fear, uncertainty, and limited medical resources. Physicians, known as mediti, held a respected position in Roman society. Many were trained in Greek medicine, particularly the works of Hippocrates and Galen, and placed great emphasis on balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to result from an imbalance of these fluids, and treatments often involved bloodletting, purging, or herbal remedies. Wealthier citizens could afford regular consultations, exotic herbs, and treatments in specialized facilities or spa towns, while the poor relied on local knowledge, home remedies, and the generosity of neighbors. The city itself offered a chaotic medical landscape. Markets were filled with herbalists, apothecaries, and vendors selling charms and amulets to ward off evil spirits believed to cause disease. Kitchens became spaces of experimentation, with families boiling herbs like rue, garlic, and mint into potions intended to strengthen the body or cure fevers. Some remedies were purely practical, such as applying vinegar to wounds or using honey to soothe sores, while others relied on superstition, like hanging protective talismans or performing small rituals to appease the gods. Healers came in many forms. Some were formally trained physicians with years of study behind them. Others were wandering practitioners, often women who relied on herbal knowledge and intuitive care. Midwives, for example, played a crucial role in delivering babies safely, but they also acted as community health advisors, providing advice on nutrition, hygiene, and minor illnesses. Their knowledge was often dismissed by the elite, but proved indispensable for ordinary citizens. Daily life during times of sickness required adaptability. Families isolated the sick as best they could, prepared nutrient-rich foods, and maintained cleanliness in crowded homes. Public baths, once centers of hygiene and social interaction, were approached with caution as people feared contamination. Neighbors and relatives often took turns caring for the sick, fetching water, preparing remedies, and offering comfort. Even in wealthy households, the fear of infection could disrupt normal routines, forcing servants, merchants, and family members to adjust to new patterns of caution and care. Beyond practical measures, Romans sought psychological reassurance. Amulets, prayers, and rituals provided a sense of control in an otherwise unpredictable world. Visiting a healer was as much about hope and guidance as it was about physical treatment. Letters, inscriptions, and anecdotal records show countless small gestures of care. A father preparing herbal tea for a child, a neighbor offering an ointment for a fever, or a healer carefully measuring ingredients while reciting protective incantations. These acts, though simple, reflected the resilience and ingenuity of ordinary Romans. The interplay between scholarly medicine and folk remedies created a vibrant, though imperfect, system of care. Despite limited understanding of contagion, Romans experimented with isolation, sanitation, and herbal medicine, often learning from experience. These approaches reveal a society grappling with vulnerability, yet unwilling to surrender to it. Even when treatments failed, the very act of trying, of caring, experimenting, and believing fostered a sense of agency and solidarity among communities. Ultimately, Roman medicine was more than science or superstition. It was a reflection of the values, fears, and creativity of the people who lived within the empire. It was a window into how ordinary Romans confronted mortality, sought protection, and adapted in a world where life could change in a single day. Through their remedies, rituals, and resourcefulness, they demonstrated a profound determination to preserve life, even in the most uncertain circumstances. Everyday life in Rome, during a health crisis, required constant adaptation, ingenuity, and a careful balance between fear and necessity. Ordinary citizens had to navigate crowded streets, bustling markets, and close-knit living quarters while avoiding illness as best they could. Homes, often small and shared among multiple families, became sites of both refuge and risk. Families improvised, dedicating specific rooms for the sick, fumigating living spaces with aromatic herbs like rosemary, thyme, and juniper, and cleaning floors and surfaces with vinegar or water infused with citrus peels. Food played a central role in both survival and comfort. With disruptions in trade and agriculture, staple ingredients such as wheat, olive oil, and wine could become scarce. Wealthier households stocked preserves, dried fruits, and imported goods, while poorer Romans relied on grains, legumes, and whatever seasonal vegetables were available. Bread sellers and bakers faced challenges as flour shortages and illness among workers slowed production. Families improvised meals, often boiling grains into porridge, mixing herbs for flavor and medicinal purposes, and fermenting foods to extend their shelf life. Work routines were disrupted, yet survival demanded continuity. Artisans, laborers, and merchants adapted by staggering their activities, avoiding crowded marketplaces, or delivering goods directly to homes when possible. Trade and commerce did not cease entirely, but fear of contagion reshaped how people interacted, creating a new rhythm of distance, caution, and innovation. Even the city's infrastructure, aqueducts, baths, and public spaces required attention as sanitation became a key factor in preventing further illness. Community networks were crucial. Neighbors checked in on one another, offering water, food, and emotional support. Children, though vulnerable, were often tasked with small duties, fetching supplies, tending to animals, or helping care for sick relatives. Elders shared knowledge of traditional remedies, planting advice, and spiritual practices, passing down strategies that had kept families alive through past hardships. Social gatherings diminished, but informal support systems strengthened, demonstrating the resilience of Roman society. Spiritual life intertwined with daily survival. Romans consulted household gods, lairs and penates, priests and soothsayers for guidance, protection, and reassurance. Rituals included offerings, prayers, and even temporary sacrifices designed to ward off misfortune and restore balance to a disrupted world. For many, these spiritual practices offered a measure of control in an environment dominated by uncertainty, reinforcing both faith and community bonds. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, yet families sought to protect them through careful monitoring, herbal treatments, and isolation when needed. Education and leisure were often put aside, replaced with practical skills and cooperative labor. The marketplace of ideas shifted toward survival, which foods kept best, which herbs soothed fevers, which routes to avoid in the city, and which neighbors could be trusted for help. Even with these measures, fear remained pervasive. Rumors spread quickly, and every cough or fever could provoke anxiety. Letters and personal accounts from the era reveal the tension between hope and despair, families celebrating small recoveries while mourning neighbors lost to disease, balancing grief with the relentless necessity of daily work and care. Ultimately, life in Rome during this period was defined by adaptability, resilience, and the persistent human drive to maintain normalcy amidst crisis. Citizens balanced practical survival strategies with rituals, remedies, and social support, creating a delicate framework that allowed communities to endure. In kitchens, markets, streets, and homes, Romans demonstrated the ingenuity and solidarity that made it possible to carry on, even under the shadow of uncertainty and death. Life in Rome during this period was shaped not only by the ravages of disease, but also by the rigid social hierarchies that defined Roman society. The plague did not affect all Romans equally. Wealth, status, occupation, and location determine not only the level of exposure, but also the means of coping with illness and scarcity. The contrasts between the elite, middle classes, and poor were stark, revealing the fragile yet resilient threads that held Roman society together during crisis. At the pinnacle of Roman society, senators, equestrians, and wealthy patricians were better insulated from the worst effects of the epidemic. They could retreat to spacious country villas or suburban estates, away from the densely packed city streets where disease spread fastest. These estates were not mere luxuries, they were sanctuaries, allowing the elite to implement isolation strategies unavailable to the masses. Here, they could call upon physicians trained in the medical texts of Galen and Hippocrates, hire attendants to tend to the sick, and maintain well stocked pantries filled with preserved foods, imported grains, and exotic herbs. Even so, wealth could not shield them from anxiety. Letters and diaries reveal their constant fear, the dread of losing family members, and the stress of maintaining appearances while grappling with vulnerability. Social gatherings, political duties, and public obligations were disrupted, and many of the privileged wrestled with guilt or despair over their relative safety compared to the suffering of the urban poor. By contrast, life for the lower classes was a daily struggle for survival. Families crowded into insulae, multi-story apartment buildings, often constructed hastily with poor materials, lived in close quarters with minimal sanitation. Garbage and waste accumulated in narrow streets, and access to clean water was limited, accelerating the spread of disease. Daily life was punctuated by fear, the fear of infection, hunger, and economic collapse. Survival often depended on the generosity of neighbors, communal sharing of resources, and the ability to improvise remedies from local herbs and foodstuffs. Public granaries, charity from temples, or occasional handouts from wealthier citizens could make the difference between life and death, but they were unpredictable and insufficient. For many, every day was a negotiation between exposure and necessity, venturing into the marketplace to buy essential goods while risking contagion or staying home and facing hunger. The middle tiers of society, including soldiers, tradesmen, and laborers, occupied a precarious space between relative safety and exposure. Roman soldiers, responsible for defending the empire's borders and maintaining public order, found themselves particularly vulnerable. Military camps became potential hotspots for contagion. Infected recruits could decimate units, compromising the defense of far-flung provinces. Laborers and artisans, whose work in markets, workshops, and construction sites was essential to urban life, could not afford to stop working. Their livelihoods forced them into crowded spaces, intensifying their risk of falling ill. These individuals navigated a delicate balance between economic survival and personal safety, often relying on shared knowledge of folk remedies, protective rituals, or avoidance strategies to protect themselves and their families. Women played a central role in sustaining households across all classes. In wealthy homes, women oversaw domestic staff, managed medical care, and organized food preparation and sanitation. In poorer households, women were the backbone of daily survival, tending to children, nursing the sick, and preparing makeshift medicines. Their labor, creativity, and emotional resilience were indispensable, sustaining families and communities when official structures and resources faltered. Religious practices, too, were often guided by women who led prayers, rituals, and offerings to seek divine protection for their households. Children, regardless of social class, experienced the plague as both a threat and a harsh teacher. Elite children might remain secluded within villas, shielded from public spaces, and given private tutors who adapted lessons to a homebound life. Children of the lower classes, however, were exposed to illness and loss at every turn. Many were required to help with chores, fetch water, assist siblings, or contribute to family businesses, all while navigating the fear and uncertainty surrounding them. Childhood became an accelerated lesson in resilience, resourcefulness, and survival. The plague did more than claim lives. It disrupted the very lifeblood of Roman urban existence, trade and food supply. Markets that once buzzed with merchants, shoppers, and travelers became eerily quiet or chaotic, depending on the day and neighborhood. The lifelines that connected Rome to distant provinces, delivering grain from Egypt, olive oil from Hispania, and wine from Gaul, faltered under the strain of disease, fear, and labor shortages. Supply chains that seemed invincible were suddenly fragile, revealing the vulnerability of an empire built on interdependence and constant movement. In the city itself, markets or fora became precarious zones of commerce. Vendors struggled to maintain stock as farmers and traders either fell ill or abandoned the roads leading into the capital. Prices for basic staples such as bread, grain, olive oil, and legumes soared, creating tension and unrest among the population. Hunger was no longer a theoretical threat. It was an immediate and tangible danger for the poor, who depended on daily access to affordable food. Wealthy Romans, though insulated from scarcity, still faced logistical challenges. Their cooks and servants were at risk of infection, and supply delays threatened the lavish feasts that reinforced social status. The flow of grain from provinces like Egypt was critical, particularly for Rome's plebeian population. Grain shipments were transported along complex routes, passing through ports, river channels, and warehouses before reaching the city's Annona, the state-managed grain distribution system. The plague disrupted every stage. Port laborers fell ill, transport caravans were delayed or abandoned, and warehouses struggled to maintain sanitation. The resulting shortages meant that even state-sponsored distributions could not fully meet the city's needs, exacerbating anxiety and social unrest. Bread riots, although less frequent than in earlier crises, became more common in certain districts, highlighting the delicate balance between government provision and public survival. Local trade networks also adapted in remarkable ways. Neighborhood bakers, butchers, and market stalls adjusted by rationing supplies, prioritizing regular customers, or negotiating new partnerships with nearby farmers. Bartering became more frequent in some areas as coins lost value amidst uncertainty, and families relied on exchanges of goods and labor to survive. Religious institutions sometimes acted as informal suppliers, distributing grain, wine, or oil to the needy, while private philanthropists attempted to mitigate shortages through acts of charity. Yet these efforts, though noble, could only reach a fraction of those in need. The agricultural impact of the plague extended beyond urban centers. Rural estates and small farms faced a shortage of laborers as disease claimed workers or drove them to flee to less populated areas. Crops rotted in fields left untended, livestock suffered from neglect or illness, and trade caravans struggled to collect and transport produce. Some landowners attempted to hire replacement workers from distant provinces, but the risks of travel and contagion limited these efforts. Consequently, food production contracted, feeding back into the urban shortages that would define daily life in Rome for years to come. Public nutrition and diet underwent shifts as a result of scarcity. Where bread and grain had been staples, substitutes such as legumes, vegetables, and foraged foods gained prominence among the poor. Wealthier households, unable to maintain imports of exotic goods, relied on locally produced foods, simpler preparations, and careful rationing. The plague forced Romans to confront the fragility of abundance and the importance of resource management in ways that would resonate across generations. Travel and trade disruptions also hindered the flow of luxury goods, from imported spices to silks, affecting not only daily life but also social rituals. Feasts, banquets, and religious offerings were scaled back or altered, reflecting both practical necessity and the emotional weight of living under constant threat. Merchants, whose livelihoods depended on these goods, suffered economic losses, while artisans faced decreased demand for luxury items. The plague therefore reshaped not only sustenance but also the broader patterns of consumption, status display, and social interaction in Rome. Yet human ingenuity persisted amid these challenges. Romans experimented with preservation techniques, such as drying, salting, and fermenting foods, to extend supplies. Neighborhood cooperatives emerged to pool resources, share labor, and maintain markets. Local officials attempted to stabilize prices and prevent hoarding, although enforcement was uneven. The interplay of scarcity, adaptation, and resilience illustrates a society struggling to maintain normalcy while confronting unprecedented disruption. Life in Rome during the plague forced a confrontation with one of the city's most vulnerable systems: healthcare. Medicine was a mixture of empirical observation, inherited Greek knowledge, superstition, and spiritual practice. Roman physicians, or medici, often relied on texts from Hippocrates and Galen, emphasizing the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, as central to health. Illness was perceived not merely as a physical imbalance, but as a disruption in the body's harmony with nature and the divine. Medical treatment varied greatly depending on wealth and social status. The wealthy could summon physicians to their villas, afford rare herbs and imported remedies, or access private baths and medicinal springs. Treatments included bloodletting, purges, and topical applications designed to rebalance the humors. Some physicians experimented with early surgical techniques, though these were largely limited to external injuries or abscesses. Internal infections were largely untreatable. Despite these efforts, the plague's virulence rendered most interventions ineffective. For the majority of Romans, particularly the urban poor, remedies were homegrown or rooted in superstition. Families relied on herbal mixtures, incense, and prayers, often guided by older relatives or neighborhood healers. Garlic, vinegar, myrrh, and various plant poultices were common, sometimes combined with ritualistic acts to ward off unseen forces believed to cause disease. Amulets, charms, and household rituals reflected a deeply held belief that illness could be influenced by divine or mystical forces. Public health infrastructure in Rome was minimal and mostly preventive rather than curative. Aqueducts, sewers, and baths helped reduce the prevalence of common illnesses, but they offered little protection against a pandemic of this magnitude. Streets and public spaces, once teeming with commerce and social activity, became vectors of fear. Citizens avoided gatherings, washed hands more frequently, and limited contact with the sick, although understanding of contagion remained primitive. Temples and religious institutions played a dual role in medicine. Priests offered spiritual solace, rituals, and sacrifices intended to appease the gods, particularly Apollo and Asclepius, deities associated with healing. Some temples functioned as informal treatment centers, distributing herbal remedies or water from sacred springs, blending piety with practical aid. Faith and superstition often provided comfort, even when cures were ineffective. Interestingly, some Romans began to notice patterns in the spread of disease. Dense urban quarters with poor ventilation and unsanitary conditions were recognized as particularly dangerous. Families often fled to the countryside if they had the means, seeking isolation and cleaner air. This rudimentary form of quarantine, though not scientifically grounded, reflected an emerging understanding of environmental factors in disease transmission. The plague also highlighted inequalities in healthcare access. While affluent Romans could purchase remedies and summon skilled physicians, the majority faced illness with minimal support. Mortality rates were highest among the poor, who lived in overcrowded insulae apartment blocks, relied on communal water sources, and had limited access to nutritious food. Women and children, especially those responsible for caring for sick relatives, bore additional burdens, navigating both domestic labor and the fear of contagion. Despite these challenges, the crisis spurred small innovations and adaptations. Families experimented with herbal combinations, surgical techniques were cautiously refined, and some physicians documented symptoms and outcomes in greater detail. These practices contributed incrementally to the empirical knowledge that would guide Roman medicine for centuries, even as the immediate threat of the plague left many lessons painfully incomplete. Ultimately, Roman healthcare during the plague revealed a society balancing rational observation, spiritual belief, and improvisation. It demonstrated both the resilience and limitations of ancient medicine, exposing vulnerabilities while also highlighting the human drive to preserve life, seek knowledge, and find hope in the face of overwhelming mortality. The interplay of science, superstition, and social inequality shaped every attempt to survive the epidemic, leaving a lasting imprint on the city's collective memory. The city of Rome, once vibrant and full of life, became a shadow of its former self. Streets that had thrummed with the daily bustle of merchants, children playing, and senators traversing to political assemblies fell unnervingly silent. Occasionally, the wails of the sick or the low moans of the dying broke the oppressive quiet, echoing off stone walls and empty plazas. Fear, previously a distant concept for most citizens, had become a constant companion. Anxiety did not remain private. It spread like the plague itself, weaving into every conversation, every glance, every hesitant step in the marketplace. Public spaces, forums, theaters, baths, and markets that had once symbolized Roman civic pride and social cohesion were abandoned. Merchants shuttered their shops, artisans left their workshops unattended, and the essential flow of goods and services slowed to a crawl. With farmers falling ill and supply routes disrupted, food shortages became inevitable. Bread, the staple of the Roman diet, grew scarce, and once stable prices soared. Citizens jostled anxiously for provisions, sometimes resulting in heated disputes, physical confrontations, or desperate theft. Markets, which had been centers of community, now became arenas of suspicion and mistrust. Religion surged as both comfort and explanation. Temples were crowded with supplicants seeking divine intervention, burning incense, offering sacrifices, and imploring omens from priests. Superstition grew alongside devotion. Some Romans believed the epidemic was divine punishment for impiety or moral corruption, while others suspected witches or heretics of bringing the gods' wrath upon the city. These beliefs fueled social divisions. Neighbors accused one another of wrongdoing, scapegoating individuals or groups in hopes of appeasing the gods. leading to ostracism, mob harassment, or even executions. Fear permeated private life as well. Families faced impossible choices when illness struck. To care for the sick risked exposing everyone in the household. To abandon them seemed cruel, even morally unthinkable. Servants and slaves, living in close quarters with their masters, were particularly vulnerable. Some chose flight, fleeing the city to escape infection, while others were forcibly confined, adding layers of tension between social classes. The plague not only threatened health, but also disrupted the intricate social hierarchies and obligations that structured Roman daily life. Public authorities were overwhelmed. Magistrates, governors, and city officials struggled to maintain basic civic functions. Burial of the dead became a logistical nightmare. Cemeteries overflowed, forcing hurried mass graves. The sacred rituals surrounding death, so central to Roman identity, were truncated or ignored entirely, leaving families in despair and survivors in shock. Enforcement of curfews, organization of relief efforts, and maintenance of essential services faltered under the weight of the crisis. Rome's once imposing institutions now seemed fragile, inadequate, and vulnerable to collapse. Despite the fear and chaos, human resilience persisted. Small acts of solidarity appeared across neighborhoods. Citizens shared food, water, and herbal remedies with neighbors, and some families devised rudimentary quarantine measures to limit the spread of disease. Street networks were reorganized informally to care for the sick, and clandestine aid groups emerged, motivated by compassion rather than authority. These attempts to maintain community amidst devastation reflected both Roman resourcefulness and the enduring human instinct to protect one another, even in the darkest times. The psychological toll was immense. Trust, the cornerstone of Roman civic life, eroded under the weight of suspicion, scarcity, and loss. People became wary of strangers and neighbors alike, and social bonds were strained by fear and desperation. Children grew up in a city where play was overshadowed by caution. Adults navigated each day with anxiety, knowing that illness could strike at any moment. Civic rituals and celebrations were abandoned, and festivals that once united communities were either canceled or modified beyond recognition. Rome's economy, once a complex and resilient engine driving the empire, began to crumble under the relentless pressure of the epidemic. Trade slowed to a near standstill as merchants and traders succumbed to illness or abandoned their posts in fear of infection. The flow of essential goods, grain from Egypt, olive oil from Hispania, and wine from Gaul, became erratic, leaving city dwellers increasingly dependent on whatever local resources could be mustered. Urban warehouses emptied quickly, and scarcity became a daily reality for the majority of Romans. Labor shortages struck every sector. Farmers who had tended fields and orchards were debilitated or dead, leaving crops unharvested and livestock unattended. Construction projects, long a symbol of Roman ambition and engineering prowess, ground to a halt. Roads and aqueducts fell into disrepair, not immediately noticeable, but gradually affecting the city's infrastructure. Artisans and craftsmen, pillars of the urban economy, were absent from their workshops, and the production of luxury goods, which had once fueled trade networks across the Mediterranean, slowed to a trickle. Inflation soared. Food became an unpredictable commodity, with prices fluctuating wildly, depending on local availability and the whims of opportunistic traders. Bread, the lifeline of the Roman populace, became increasingly expensive, and many families found themselves reducing portions or skipping meals entirely. Those who had accumulated wealth saw its value diminish in the face of scarcity, while the poor, already vulnerable, suffered the most severe consequences. Desperation fueled theft, looting, and crime, further destabilizing neighborhoods already fractured by fear and mistrust. Bartering and informal economies emerged as coping mechanisms. Citizens exchanged goods and services directly, grain for wine, pottery for clothing, or labor for food. These makeshift economies highlighted both the resourcefulness and vulnerability of a population under siege. Wealthy families sometimes offered payment in kind rather than coin, reflecting the breakdown of formal market systems. Meanwhile, enslaved populations experienced a paradoxical shift. Some were abandoned as their masters fled or died, while others were pressed into service to sustain essential household or agricultural functions. The empire's fiscal structure strained under the demands of the epidemic. Tax collection became sporadic and inefficient. Local magistrates, tasked with ensuring the state's revenue, were often forced to negotiate with citizens who could not pay. Military funding suffered as soldiers fell ill or deserted, and the maintenance of fortifications and borders weakened. The Roman government, already dealing with internal political instability, faced the double challenge of addressing both public health and economic collapse, a task it was ill-equipped to manage. Despite these hardships, survival prompted ingenuity. Citizens devised ways to preserve perishable food, store water, and protect livestock from disease. Community gardens, shared storage facilities, and small-scale cooperative ventures appeared in neighborhoods willing to band together. People scavenged, abandoned estates, or repurposed public spaces to sustain themselves. While these efforts were not sufficient to restore the economy, they demonstrated a tenacity and adaptability that helped some communities weather the crisis better than others. The psychological impact of economic collapse was profound. Romans who had once relied on a stable network of trade credit and civic support found themselves navigating a world where uncertainty dictated every decision. Families negotiated the delicate balance between conserving resources and risking exposure to illness in search of necessities. Social hierarchies were challenged as wealth became less reliable than proximity, skill, or sheer resilience. The epidemic did not discriminate entirely, but it exacerbated existing inequalities, creating new social tensions alongside the already pervasive fear. By the end of this period, Rome had entered a state of profound economic vulnerability. Institutions that had previously guaranteed stability, from marketplaces to taxation systems, were fractured, leaving survival dependent on local networks, resourcefulness, and sheer endurance. The struggle for daily sustenance revealed both the fragility and the adaptability of Roman society, illustrating how an epidemic could ripple far beyond the sickbed to affect every facet of life, from governance and commerce to social order and human relationships. In the midst of sickness and death, many Romans turned to religion and superstition for comfort, explanation, and hope. The plague of Cyprian disrupted daily life so thoroughly that no household, neighborhood, or social class remained untouched, prompting widespread reflection on mortality, fate, and divine will. Temples, shrines, and altars became focal points not only for worship, but for desperation, as Romans sought protection from invisible forces they could neither understand nor control. Traditional Roman religion, with its pantheon of gods and structured rituals, offered a framework to interpret catastrophe. Jupiter, King of the gods, was invoked for protection over the state, Mars, god of war, for strength against adversity, and Apollo, god of healing, was called upon in hopes of curing the sick. Sacrifices, libations, and prayers were performed with increasing frequency as families attempted to appease divine powers perceived to have withdrawn their favor. Priests and augurs gained prominence, guiding communities in ritual observances meant to restore harmony between humans and the divine. Alongside official religion, superstition thrived. Amulets, charms, and talismans were commonly worn or displayed in homes to ward off illness. Some Romans adopted extreme practices, carrying herbs believed to purify the air, burning incense to chase away disease, or avoiding certain foods and places thought to be cursed. The lines between medicine and superstition often blurred. Herbal remedies might be accompanied by prayers, and charms could be considered as essential as the application of a poultice. Christianity, still a minority faith in the empire, experienced a complex transformation during this crisis. For some, the plague reinforced fear and isolation, while others found in the new religion a source of solace, community, and moral explanation. Christian communities tended to care for the sick regardless of social standing, which not only strengthened internal bonds, but occasionally drew admiration from the wider populace. Tales of martyrs, healing, and divine intervention spread, offering hope where traditional remedies failed. Superstition also had darker consequences. Fear of contagion led to scapegoating and suspicion, and rumors of witchcraft or divine punishment could result in social unrest. Families might shun neighbors who had been ill, believing them to be cursed or contaminated. Conversely, some Romans misattributed survival or recovery to miraculous intervention, further reinforcing the belief that divine favor could dictate life or death. Religious festivals and public ceremonies, once vibrant expressions of civic life, were curtailed or modified. Crowds were dangerous, but avoidance of ritual was itself seen as risking divine anger. Romans were caught in a paradox. Gathering could invite illness, yet failing to gather could invite the gods' wrath. Households often adapted, performing miniature rituals privately while still observing the symbolic essence of public ceremonies. The psychological effects of this spiritual turbulence were profound. For many, the epidemic was not simply a medical crisis, but a crisis of meaning. Loss, uncertainty, and isolation prompted questions about morality, the afterlife, and the nature of suffering. Romans reflected on their own behavior, societal inequities, and the fragility of life, sometimes leading to renewed piety, sometimes to cynicism or despair. Ultimately, the interplay between religion, superstition, and daily life revealed the human need for explanation in the face of incomprehensible disaster. Romans relied on gods, charms, rituals, and faith as both shields against fear and tools for understanding the chaos around them. While these practices could not halt the plague, they shaped behavior, offered community support, and provided a sense of agency, even if illusory, during one of the most terrifying periods in the empire's history. Daily life in Rome, once defined by bustling streets, crowded markets, and constant social interaction, was abruptly transformed. The familiar rhythms of the city, children playing in the forums, merchants shouting their wares, neighbors gathering in the baths or around the fountains, were replaced by silence, fear, and an ever-present sense of vulnerability. Families who had once lived in close quarters now avoided even casual visits, fearing that any interaction could bring illness into their homes. The social fabric, which had long been the backbone of Roman urban life, began to fray under the immense pressure of sickness and death. Neighborhoods, once vibrant and lively, became eerily quiet. Public spaces that had served as centers of civic life, the Forum, the Colosseum, and local temples, were avoided or closed. Religious ceremonies continued in private or in small, cautious groups as citizens sought spiritual solace while minimizing contact with others. Markets, once teeming with activity, were reduced to shadowed lanes where sellers displayed only the most essential goods and buyers approached cautiously, keeping their distance. The sense of community that had defined Roman identity suffered, replaced by suspicion and the instinct for self-preservation. Families faced profound challenges. Multi-generational households, common in Roman society, became high-risk environments. Caring for sick parents, grandparents, and children often meant direct exposure to disease, forcing difficult choices and sometimes heartbreaking isolation. In the poorer districts, cramped insulae made it nearly impossible to separate the sick from the healthy, increasing mortality rates among the urban poor. Slaves, integral to household functioning, were particularly vulnerable. They continued to work, cook, clean, and provide essential services while having minimal access to medical care, and their suffering was often invisible in official records. Yet, even in the midst of fear and suffering, traces of resilience appeared. Neighbors risked their own health to deliver food, water, and medicine to the infirm, creating informal networks of aid. Local leaders and wealthy patrons sometimes organized grain distributions, coordinated burial teams, and enforced rudimentary public health measures to prevent further contagion. Religious and philosophical communities offered both spiritual guidance and practical assistance. Christians, in particular, emphasized care for the sick and mourning for the dead, setting an example of compassion that strengthened social bonds even as the city's population shrank. The psychological toll of isolation was immense. Loneliness, anxiety, and grief permeated every household. Children watched parents fall ill, couples mourned lost partners, and citizens struggled to understand why their world had become so precarious. Fear bred suspicion, and even trusted friends and family could become sources of anxiety. Yet human ingenuity and emotional resilience persisted. Romans adapted by holding smaller private rituals at home, using symbolic gestures to maintain a sense of normalcy and cultural continuity despite external chaos. Class divisions amplified the disparities in experience. Wealthy Romans could escape to villas in the countryside, where lower population density reduced their exposure and allowed for greater autonomy. Poorer citizens, confined to crowded urban apartments, faced relentless proximity to disease and limited access to resources. The unequal burden of the epidemic revealed the vulnerabilities of Rome's social and economic structures, leaving lasting effects on trust, hierarchy, and communal life. Amid these hardships, community support remained crucial. Informal networks of aid, friends leaving baskets of food at doorsteps, neighbors assisting with burials, and religious groups providing care, demonstrated that even in times of crisis, Romans valued human connection. Social rituals adapted rather than disappeared. Household prayers, small commemorations for the dead, and symbolic gestures of respect helped maintain cultural identity and psychological resilience. Ultimately, the epidemic reshaped not only the city's streets, but the very essence of Roman social life. Trust was tested, bonds were strained, and fear became a constant companion. Yet through acts of kindness, courage, and adaptation, the citizens of Rome navigated isolation and uncertainty, balancing the human need for connection with the harsh realities of survival. The legacy of these social transformations would echo long after the epidemic passed, influencing how Romans perceived community, responsibility, and the fragility of daily life in the face of catastrophic disease. The fabric of Rome's economy, already complex and heavily reliant on trade, agriculture, and skilled labor, was severely tested during the plague of Cyprian. Markets that once buzzed with merchants and craftsmen fell eerily silent, as both fear and illness kept citizens from participating in daily commerce. The disruption rippled through every sector. Farmers struggled to harvest crops without sufficient labor, bakers and millers found themselves short-handed, and merchants feared transporting goods along roads teeming with sickness. The result was a chain reaction of scarcity, inflation, and widespread uncertainty. Labor shortages became acute. Slaves and freedmen, who formed the backbone of much of Rome's workforce, were particularly affected. Many fell ill, leaving households and businesses understaffed. Skilled artisans, potters, blacksmiths, weavers could not maintain production, leading to disruptions in essential supplies from clothing to tools. Wealthier households and patrons attempted to mitigate these shortages by offering higher wages or incentives, but fear of contagion often outweighed financial motivation. Rural estates, dependent on seasonal labor for planting and harvesting, faced catastrophic reductions in output, jeopardizing food security for both urban and rural populations. Trade, both domestic and international, suffered dramatically. Rome's reliance on imported grain from Egypt and North Africa was jeopardized by interrupted shipping routes, quarantines, and fear of infected ports. Merchants delayed or canceled shipments, and local populations scrambled to secure whatever supplies were available. In cities, bread shortages became increasingly common, prompting social unrest and a resurgence of looting in some districts. Economic strain extended to luxury goods as well. Items like silks, wine, and fine pottery, once symbols of wealth and status, became rare or prohibitively expensive. In response to these hardships, Romans devised a variety of survival strategies. Wealthier citizens retreated to their countryside villas, relying on stored provisions and local resources to shield themselves from urban contagion. Middle-class families often pooled resources with neighbors or relatives, sharing food, water, and shelter to stretch dwindling supplies. For the urban poor, survival required ingenuity and resilience. Scavenging, bartering, and joining communal efforts to secure food became necessary for day-to-day existence. Markets were adapted, sometimes held in less crowded areas, and goods were exchanged under strict precautions to minimize contact. Bartering re-emerged as a significant economic practice, particularly in neighborhoods heavily affected by the plague. Coins, once a universal medium, were feared as potential carriers of disease. In some areas, local authorities encouraged the use of pre-cleansed or specially designated coins, but informal trade often bypassed official regulations. This period demonstrated Rome's economic flexibility as citizens adapted to ensure that essential goods, grain, oil, water, and firewood continued to circulate despite fear and scarcity. Agriculture, the backbone of Rome's economy, faced a profound challenge. Fields went unplowed, crops rotted in the sun, and vineyards were left untended. Rural communities adopted survival strategies such as communal harvesting, reliance on hardy crops, and increased preservation techniques, including drying and salting food. Livestock, vulnerable to both disease and neglect, were slaughtered earlier than planned, creating temporary surpluses but long-term shortages. Inflation surged as scarcity increased the value of essentials. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed, creating tension between social classes. Wealthier citizens often hoarded supplies, intensifying resentment among the poor. In some districts, local magistrates attempted to impose price controls or rationing measures, but enforcement was inconsistent, and black market trading became widespread. The plague thus not only disrupted production and labor, but also reshaped the economic landscape, highlighting inequality and testing the resilience of Roman governance. The plague of Cyprian was not only a physical and economic crisis, but also a profound cultural and spiritual upheaval. That as sickness swept through cities and countryside alike, Romans confronted questions of fate, mortality, and divine will. Traditional religious practices, rooted in centuries old rituals, suddenly seemed insufficient to explain or halt the devastation. Citizens turned to both established temples and emerging cults, seeking protection, meaning, and hope amidst chaos. Public worship, once a regular and communal activity, underwent a noticeable transformation. Temples of Jupiter, Mars, and other deities saw dwindling attendance as fear of contagion kept many away from gatherings. In contrast, smaller localized shrines and household altars became central to daily spiritual life. Families performed prayers and offerings at home, often improvising rituals to honor deities believed to influence health and disease. The personalization of religious practice reflected both fear and ingenuity, as Romans sought divine favor while minimizing exposure to the sick. New cults and religious movements gained momentum during this period, offering alternative interpretations of the plague. Some emphasized asceticism and purification, encouraging followers to abstain from indulgence as a means of spiritual protection. Others claimed prophetic insights into the causes and remedies of the epidemic, sometimes blending traditional Roman beliefs with foreign influences from Egypt, the Near East, and beyond. Christian communities, still in the early stages of expansion, attracted attention for their emphasis on charity, communal support, and care for the sick. Their acts of aid, tending to the ill and burying the dead, contrasted sharply with the fear-driven withdrawal of many pagans, planting seeds for the gradual growth of Christianity within the empire. Funerary customs and attitudes toward death also shifted dramatically. The sheer scale of mortality overwhelmed traditional burial practices. Families sometimes abandoned elaborate rituals, opting for simpler interments or mass graves. Professional mourners and funeral attendants were scarce, as many had succumbed to illness or fled cities. Amid this disruption, grief and religious reflection merged, with citizens relying on prayers, sacrifices, and personal vows to honor the dead and seek protection from further loss. Cultural expression adapted to reflect the crisis. Cultural expression adapted to reflect the crisis. Art and literature of the period, though less prolific due to social disruption, occasionally captured themes of mortality, divine wrath, and human resilience. Poets and writers, many of whom faced illness themselves, explored the fragility of life and the ephemeral nature of power and wealth. Murals, frescoes, and inscriptions sometimes bore symbols intended to ward off disease or commemorate those who perished, blending aesthetic expression with spiritual purpose. Philosophical perspectives also evolved. Stoicism, with its emphasis on acceptance of fate and the impermanence of worldly concerns, gained renewed appeal among citizens grappling with widespread death. Epicurean ideas, highlighting the pursuit of simple pleasures and the avoidance of fear, offered solace to those seeking to maintain mental stability in the face of uncertainty. Public debates and private discussions alike reflected a heightened awareness of mortality, encouraging a more introspective and contemplative approach to life. Communal rituals adapted as well. Festivals, once grand public spectacles, were scaled down or relocated to open-air spaces to reduce contagion. Processions and games were canceled or modified, and civic leaders often issued decrees limiting gatherings. Nevertheless, Romans found ways to maintain social cohesion, creating smaller neighborhood ceremonies and charitable events that combined devotion with practical assistance for the vulnerable. In essence, the plague reshaped Rome's spiritual and cultural landscape. It forced citizens to confront mortality directly, altering religious practice, funerary rites, and philosophical outlooks. New forms of worship, charitable behavior, and cultural expression emerged as coping mechanisms, reflecting both fear and resilience. The crisis catalyzed a transformation in how Romans understood their world, their gods, and each other, a shift whose echoes would influence the empire long after the immediate threat had passed. By the time the plague of Cyprian finally waned, Rome had been irrevocably changed. The epidemic had not only taken countless lives, but had also reshaped the social, economic, and political fabric of the empire. Streets that were once bustling with traders, children, and citizens now bore an eerie emptiness. Homes stood abandoned, fields went untilled, and the markets struggled to keep pace with demand. Survivors faced not only grief, but also the challenge of rebuilding a world that felt uncertain and fragile. Economically, the empire faced a series of cascading crises. With laborers and farmers gone, agricultural production slowed dramatically, leading to food shortages and rising prices. Trade routes, disrupted by fear and depopulation, hampered the exchange of goods and wealth. Artisans, merchants, and craftsmen were in short supply, leaving some essential industries struggling to recover. Taxes, once a reliable source of revenue for the state, fell sharply as the population dwindled. Yet despite these hardships, communities demonstrated resilience. Families pooled resources, local leaders organized emergency measures, and religious institutions often served as hubs of support, providing food, shelter, and care for the sick. The social impact of the plague was equally profound. Families mourned the loss of loved ones, often without the dignity of proper funerals, due to overwhelming death rates. The shared trauma fostered both fear and compassion. Neighbors relied on each other, forging stronger bonds in the face of adversity. Citizens became acutely aware of their mortality, which influenced behavior, decision-making, and cultural practices. Many turned to philosophical reflection, with Stoicism and other schools of thought offering guidance on resilience, acceptance, and ethical living in times of crisis. Religious life in Rome also transformed. The early Christian church, in particular, gained moral authority as its followers provided care to the sick and dying, often at great personal risk. Traditional Roman religious practices adapted, emphasizing purification, prayer, and communal support. Faith became a source of comfort, guidance, and social cohesion, helping citizens navigate a world overshadowed by death and uncertainty. Politically, the empire's leadership was tested as never before. Rulers who could respond decisively With resources, organization, and communication gained legitimacy, while failures were met with criticism and unrest. The crisis highlighted the importance of preparedness, strategic planning, and the ability to maintain morale in the face of catastrophe, a lesson Rome would carry forward for future challenges. For ordinary Romans, life slowly returned to a new form of normalcy. Markets reopened, public spaces gradually filled, and civic life resumed, though with an enduring sense of caution. Hygiene, communal support, and spiritual observances became ingrained in daily routines. Citizens had learned to live with uncertainty, balancing fear with practicality, grief with perseverance, and personal survival with communal responsibility. The plague of Cyprian left an indelible mark on Rome, shaping its culture, governance, and society for generations. It stands as a testament to human resilience, the importance of community, and the ways societies adapt in the aftermath of disaster. History remembers not only the suffering, but also the courage, creativity, and endurance of those who lived through one of Rome's darkest chapters. Even as the initial wave of the plague subsided, Rome was far from returning to normal. The epidemic had left deep scars on families, communities, and the empire itself. Entire generations were wiped out, leaving abandoned homes, overgrown streets, and silent forums that once teemed with life. Skilled laborers, farmers, artisans, builders, and soldiers had vanished, creating a vacuum that threatened the stability of cities and towns. Markets were quieter, trade slowed, and many agricultural fields lay untended, causing food shortages and famine in some regions. The empire faced not only a demographic crisis, but also a challenge to its social and economic structures. The psychological toll on survivors was profound. Fear became a constant companion, shaping everyday life. Citizens avoided crowded spaces, kept distance from strangers, and observed new, often superstitious rituals to ward off disease. Families grieved deeply, sometimes losing multiple members in a short span, and traditional funerary practices were often disrupted by sheer scale. The stories of loss were carried orally through letters and even through inscriptions on tombs, forming a collective memory that would haunt Rome for decades. Amid the despair, Rome's cultural and intellectual life adapted. Philosophers and writers grappled with mortality and the fragility of existence, often turning to Stoic teachings to find meaning and resilience. Literature explored themes of ethical responsibility, communal duty, and the impermanence of human endeavors. Religious movements, particularly early Christianity, experienced significant growth. Acts of charity, caring for the sick, and providing food and shelter became central to community life, offering hope and spiritual solace in a world ravaged by loss. Temples, shrines, and community spaces evolved to reflect the new priorities of a society seeking comfort, meaning, and guidance. Politically, the plague exposed vulnerabilities in governance. With so many officials and soldiers lost, maintaining order and defense became increasingly difficult. Provincial governors struggled to enforce laws, collect taxes, and protect borders. Yet, the crisis also revealed the resilience and adaptability of leadership. Those who organized aid, distributed food, or maintained public order gained social prestige and influence. Policies began to reflect lessons learned from the epidemic, emphasizing preparedness, infrastructure repair, and public health measures. Rome's administrators slowly adapted to the stark reality that survival depended not only on military strength, but also on social cohesion and the well-being of its population. Economically, the empire experienced a slow and uneven recovery. Trade networks were disrupted, cities struggled to sustain their populations, and labor shortages drove changes in wages and land use. Some areas saw the rise of new local powers as small communities became self-reliant, while others relied heavily on imperial support. Artisans innovated to meet changing demands, and commerce gradually resumed, though the shadow of the epidemic lingered in every transaction, every contract, and every marketplace. On a personal level, life in Rome demanded adaptability, endurance, and creativity. Survivors learned to navigate scarcity, find community support, and maintain daily routines despite the ever-present fear of disease returning. Children grew up in a world marked by absence and grief, yet they also witnessed remarkable acts of courage, generosity, and resilience. Stories of neighbors helping neighbors, physicians risking their lives to treat the sick, and families rebuilding from near total loss became central to the collective memory of Rome. The plague's impact extended far beyond physical death. It reshaped societal priorities, accelerated cultural and religious transformations, and forced Rome to confront the fragility of its civilization. Communities that survived became stronger in some ways, forging tighter bonds and rethinking their values. Leadership, governance, and civic life all bore the imprint of the epidemic, creating lessons that would influence future generations. In reflecting on the long shadow of the epidemic, it becomes clear that history is not only about dramatic events, but also about how societies endure and transform in response to crisis. Rome's story is one of survival, adaptation, and the human capacity to rebuild amid unimaginable loss. Even as cities were repopulated, markets reopened, and children were born, the memories of those dark years persisted, shaping the identity, resilience, and philosophy of an empire that had learned to live in the aftermath of tragedy. As the years passed, Rome began to emerge from the long shadow of the epidemic. Streets that had once been silent, with loss slowly hummed with renewed activity. Markets reopened, artisans returned to their workshops, and farmers reclaimed overgrown fields. The empire, though forever changed, demonstrated remarkable resilience, proving that life, even after unimaginable devastation, could adapt, endure, and flourish. The social fabric of Rome had been fundamentally altered. Families were smaller, communities tighter, and the collective memory of loss shaped new ways of living. Survivors had learned the value of cooperation, empathy, and foresight. Neighborhoods that once relied heavily on individual wealth and influence now depended on communal support, sharing resources, knowledge, and labor to rebuild. Acts of charity and solidarity became central to daily life, and civic institutions adjusted to ensure that the vulnerable widows, orphans, and the elderly were cared for. Culturally, the experience left an indelible mark. Philosophers, poets, and historians chronicled the suffering, resilience, and moral dilemmas faced during the crisis. Literature and art reflected the stark realities of mortality, but also celebrated human courage and endurance. Religion and spirituality deepened in significance. Many turned to early Christian communities, temples, and philosophical teachings for guidance and hope. These evolving beliefs reshaped societal norms, emphasizing compassion, ethical responsibility, and the importance of community over mere personal survival. Politically and economically, Rome adjusted to new realities. Leadership became more adaptive, learning from the vulnerabilities exposed by the epidemic. Officials sought better public health measures, improved infrastructure, and more effective governance to prevent future crises. Labor shortages prompted shifts in land management and trade, leading to innovations that slowly revitalized the economy. While scars remained, the empire gradually restored stability, demonstrating that even after a period of profound upheaval, recovery was possible with patience, planning, and resilience. On a personal level, life for ordinary Romans was defined by both memory and hope. Survivors carried stories of loss, courage, and solidarity that informed their daily choices. They developed resilience, resourcefulness, and a deeper appreciation for community and family. Children growing up in this era inherited both the trauma of the past and the lessons of endurance, learning to navigate a world where tragedy and triumph coexisted. Every rebuilt home, reopened market, and lively forum symbolized the human capacity to adapt and create meaning even after calamity. The long-term impact of the epidemic also shaped Rome's identity. The empire that emerged was not the same as before. It was smaller in population, perhaps more cautious, but more aware of its fragility and potential. Leaders, citizens, and scholars alike had learned that survival depended not only on military strength or wealth, but also on social cohesion, preparedness, and empathy. Rome had been tested in ways few could have imagined, yet the lessons endured, guiding future generations and leaving a legacy of resilience for centuries to come. As we look back on this period, it becomes clear that the story of Rome during and after the plague is not only a tale of suffering, but also a testament to human endurance. Societies are shaped as much by how they respond to catastrophe as by the events themselves. In the end, Rome's journey reminds us that even in the darkest times, life persists, communities adapt, and civilizations have the remarkable capacity to rise again. Thank you for joining us on this journey through ancient Rome during one of its most challenging periods. From the daily struggles of ordinary citizens to the resilience that allowed the empire to rebuild, we've explored how life endured even in the face of devastating hardship. If you found this exploration fascinating and want to uncover more untold stories from history, don't forget to subscribe to Learn History While Sleeping and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us continue bringing the past to life, one story at a time.